Okay, let's talk a little bit about the documents for the 2019 DBQ. Kind of go over some explanations so you kind of make sure everybody's on the right page with those. The prompt, just to kind of make sure everybody knows what we're going for, is right up here. Evaluate the extent to which progressive movement fostered political change in the United States from 1890 to 1920. So really when you write your thesis, you're going to be talking about what kind of changes were made, what were the problems that were occurring. So when you talk about context, you might want to talk about, the problems in the cities and the problems with a corrupt government and big businesses having too much power, consumers not being protected, the environment that was poor, women's suffrage, that was a big one, women getting the right to vote, or prior not having the right to vote. Prohibition, that was a major issue. So these are just some of the things popping in my head, just to name a few. So there's all these issues going on that are kind of dealt with during the progressive movement. So let's take a kind of a peek what they're talking about here. Document number 1 from Jane Addams, who's the founder of the Settlement House, the Hull House in Chicago, talks a little bit about party bosses. And remember, this is kind of a big deal prior to the progressive era, where immigrants that would come to the United States would get kind of plucked by these party bosses, called here powerful aldermen, which was part of the party machine. Basically, they would say, like, hey, did you want a job? And the immigrant would be like, I need a job, yes. So the party boss would give them a job. Do you need a place to live? And the person would probably say, like, yeah, I kind of need a place to live. They'd find them a room to rent or an apartment for their family or something. So basically, the party boss was attaching themselves to these immigrants and in exchange for voting for their political party. So if I got off the boat from Ireland and party boss grabs me and says, like, here's a job, here's a place to live, he expected me to, like, come election time to vote for that political party. If I didn't, obviously my job and my place to live are kind of put in jeopardy. So it's a little bit of a you wash my back, I wash yours kind of arrangement. Jane Addams from the Hull House is basically saying this is a corrupt system, and that Hull House wasn't going to operate like that. Like, Hull House's whole idea was that they wanted to create a system where they could help immigrants, people that were having a hard time of it, even if they weren't immigrants, kind of getting on their feet, getting a meal, a place to stay, teach them a skill so they'd have classes, that sort of thing. So Jane Addams was basically talking about how this system is corrupt and that Hull House wasn't going to do that. So if you got something from Hull House, you didn't have to pay them back with voting for a certain candidate. He also talked a little bit about the party bosses would sometimes, if they knew like a particular immigrant maybe got in trouble, that maybe they'd try to get them out of jail or some sort of punishment, and Hull House wouldn't do that. So if an immigrant comes to Hull House and in the meantime goes out and gets into a fight in a bar, Hull House isn't going to go and try to get them out of, they're going to make sure that person faces the law and kind of deals with the consequences. Where an alderman for a political party, so a big party boss might say, like, hey, I'll try to pull some strings, get you out of the jail, kind of get you out of this mess. And again, it was it wasn't, as they put, it was not for the right of goodwill. It was basically like a service. Like, I'm going to do this for you, and then at some point I'm going to need you to do me a favor and vote for the political party, and that's not what you believe in. Okay, so that's kind of the purpose. So Jane Addams is talking as a progressive, trying to make a change. The situation is that political corruptness with party bosses, for sure. Document number 2 is President Roosevelt, and he is talking about trust busting, basically saying that corporations are responsible to the state, meaning the government, for what they have. So they get services from the government, they get protection from the government, and because they are, indebted to the state, they have the right to be regulated by the state. So the state has to do whatever it can to control them. So obviously, Teddy Roosevelt is talking from the perspective of a trust buster to try to break up these big corporations and encourage competition among businesses. So that's kind of what he's saying is this is, in the United States, we don't want to have these gigantic companies that completely dominate or monopolize an industry. For sure. Let's talk about document number 3. This is Julian W. Mack for the Juvenile Court, talking about basically all these kids in the cities. The cities, remember, there was this huge influx of people that moved to the cities, and the cities really didn't have the means to protect or to accommodate all these people. And one of the groups that Julian Mack talks about that was a little bit victimized were kids. The kids that would go out and do things, get themselves in trouble, and, you know, commit crimes, skip school, and all of these things, and that there were no like systems set up in the cities to help these kids through this. They weren't going to help rehabilitate those kids to kind of show them where they went wrong. It was just a system basically set up to punish those kids, and that really didn't do them any favors in the long run. That's kind of what he was saying. Document 4 was a guy by the name of Hiram Johnson, who's addressing the state of California. And really, this point of view is all about a progressive reform that's looking to make the government more democratic, meaning more interactive for the people. A little bit like Jane Addams was talking about in Hull House, taking it out of the hands of the party bosses and putting it into the hands of people. Hiram Johnson advocates for a couple things, something called an initiative, a referendum, and a recall. If you don't remember what those things were, a recall is simply that we're going to call somebody out of political office. So if I'm elected governor and I'm just doing a terrible, terrible job, instead of waiting till the next time I come up for re-election, if the voters are like, Dennis is going to ruin our state if we let him go the full 4 years, let's get him out of there now. They can issue what's called a recall. So they can petition the state to have an election to say, like, let's vote on Dennis again. He's doing a terrible job. We don't want him to ruin us for 3 more years. Let's get him out now. So that's what a recall is. Initiative is, again, another thing that puts hands in the people. Initiatives are ideas for laws. So maybe there might be an initiative on the ballot to say, like, hey, this is a great idea for a new law. So citizens can vote on this if they like this idea that it should be talked about. Referendum is very simple. Referendum is if there already is an idea there. It's actually putting it to the people like, hey, do you guys like this idea? Do we want to make this law? The legalization of marijuana was on a lot of ballots in states as a referendum. Like, people were able to vote for it to see if they liked it. In Michigan, a few years back, we voted to legalize marijuana, and it was, the citizens did that through a referendum. So Hiram Johnson is basically saying all of these things would make for a more democratic society. People would have more say, more input, and it would take that say and input out of the hands of party bosses. And he kind of goes on to say, like, only people that really don't trust people to make good decisions are opposed to these kinds of things. Document number 5 is, I think, one of the probably the easier ones to kind of decipher. It's the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is a organization that is set up to try to gain civil rights for African Americans. And they're writing Woodrow Wilson, basically saying, Mr. Wilson, you have a very discriminatory government and a very discriminatory society. Can you please not have segregation in the government in Washington, D.C.? Woodrow Wilson was a pretty staunch believer in segregation, and he did not kind of cave into the pressure. Basically, the NAACP goes on to say that it's humiliating, that if there's a line that's drawn that says this is a white drinking fountain and this is a black drinking fountain, even though we both have drinking fountains, it's a little bit demoralizing to say, I'm separated from the rest of the group because of the color of my skin. Now, this sets up a whole lot of things. There's a lot of opportunity for contextualization, I think, in this one. The idea of the Jim Crow South, where segregation in restaurants and bathrooms and drinking fountains and buses, all of those things are commonplace, kind of sets that up. That Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896, that basically says that as long as you have equal facilities, you can separate the races. It's not discriminatory. This clearly is saying that is completely the opposite of what the NAACP is saying black people feel when they get separated. You can also probably contextualize and talk about the Brown versus Board of Education. it's outside of the window of which we are responsible. But if you bring it up, I'm sure they would count it as a piece of evidence. Remember, Brown versus Board of Education ended school segregation, kind of paving the way for getting rid of situations like this. Document 6 is the one I probably like the least. If I was writing this, probably the one I would use the least. It is the Detroit Commissioner of Police, and basically saying that we need to reorganize the police department, that there's a waste kind of going on, and oh, excuse me one second. Okay, so calls for a reorganization of the police department, basically saying that people want law and order. They want the police to be more organized, more efficient. You could probably contextualize this with the fact that maybe they felt that there was, in the cities especially, there was rampant crime, maybe even some organized crime activity, that sort of thing. Document 7 is one I probably would use, and let's see if we can fit in the screen all the way. Document 7 is a political cartoon that basically is saying wet or dry, basically insinuating prohibition, and those people advocating for against prohibition. In this case, the brewer who's saying like, "Hey, I need, it's going to be jobs are going to be costs. Like, there's bars, restaurants that serve alcohol. All those people are going to be are going to lose money. They're going to suffer." Now, this is the woman and the family basically saying, "Vote dry for my sake." This perspective is for somebody that is advocating for prohibition. And remember, there's a big connection between prohibition and women's rights. Remember, bars inherently were places where men went and either did something that was a little shady, like prostitution. I mean, obviously, rampant drinking, where potentially they'd go home and be abusive, or not productive in their jobs and get fired, causing harm to the family. The other thing about bars, remember, usually was only men that were allowed in there, minus like prostitutes and things. But it was a lot of times a place where men conducted business, where they would talk to party bosses, they would arrange for jobs, and they would do things in the saloons. Again, if women can't go in those saloons, they were kind of shielded from being able to participate in those kinds of things, like politics, and do those businesses. So prohibition was seen as a way to get rid of that boys' club, so women would be kind of on a more even playing field. And obviously the inherent like domestic abuse, poor productivity at work, those things were also kind of big pluses for prohibition and for the women's rights movement. This would be, if you're talking about contextualization, this would be, again, probably I think you probably could tie it into women's rights and the women's right to vote and how they're trying to become more active. The point of view is become more active. You could also tie it into organized crime, how it didn't really work, how even though we had, when Prohibition did end up getting kind of enacted, that it was ignored, and brewers maybe didn't have a legal business, but maybe they were still putting it out there and bootlegging it, and there was still plenty of alcohol that was getting run into the country. It went for a higher price, and some unsavory characters like Al Capone and other gangsters were kind of involved. So you could probably work some contextualization in there with that. That would be good stuff. So, all right, if anybody has any questions on these, please feel free to contact me. I will be around. Hopefully this helps. See you guys later.